It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com, where our mission is to help you accelerate your DFS learning curve and get you over that hump to profitability. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm here with my partner and co-host, Josh Kalachi. Josh, how we doing this morning, buddy?
Doing well. Back for another week, daily fantasy baseball. There's a lot of aces on the mound tonight. It's going to be a lot of fun. Going to have to find some value tonight with all these high-priced players. Not just pitchers. There's some high-priced hitters tonight too. So we're definitely going to have to find it out. One quick bit of news: the Orioles-White Sox game is postponed for tonight, so be sure to stay away from that. Of course, it's postponed with the unfortunate riots going on in Baltimore. Looking forward to a great show. Should be another one. Looking forward to another great 3 shows this week. Like always, every single week. You can find us on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday here at rotocurve.com.
Now, just a quick question from me before we get into that, because I actually didn't hear about that, the Baltimore game. I thought they were trying to play it a little earlier today was the word. Is that definite that it's off?
Yeah, I just heard on the news right before we came to the show that they were postponing it because I think it had something to do with the curfew at 10 because
they want
it's a citywide curfew. They all have to be out by 10. So you can't predict baseball. It's one of the great things about the sport. So if it goes to extra innings, they can't just send all those people home, but they're going to have to because it's under law, unfortunately.
Yeah, that actually hurts because I've been waiting to play some of these Orioles against Hector Noesi for a couple days right now. So I got to go back and change a couple lineups when we get off the air here. But anyway, let's get into the show for today, guys. As always, I'll give you a little rundown of what we're going to go over. We're going to start with a recap of last night. We'll get into Josh will bring you some weather concerns that we have been looking at, and I'll go on and give you some of the Vegas lines and things that we see from the Vegas lines after that. We'll get into talking about pitchers a little bit, and then after pitchers, we're going to have 2 teaching points today. The first one is going to go along with a recent article I just posted up on rotocurve.com. And the idea is a lot of people have been asking us, well, what do you guys mean when you say this guy's in a good spot or that guy's in a good spot when we're talking about our hitters? So I'm going to go over what we had a little bit in that article and kind of give you guys an idea of, when Josh and I say he's in a good spot tonight, what we mean by saying that guy is actually in a good spot tonight. And then, as always, we'll get into some of our hitters. And then Josh is actually going to teach you guys a little bit about what it means to be contrarian and the right way to be contrarian. It's not just, oh, well, let me pick this guy because nobody else is going to pick this guy. But there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, and Josh will kind of break that down a little bit for you guys so you have a better understanding of it. And then, as always, we'll end the show with, the cornerstones that Josh and I are going to be using to build our lineups and give you guys an idea of which way we're likely to go tonight with everything that we have. So that's the show we got lined up for you today. We're pretty excited about it, starting another week of the curve here at rotocurve.com. So that's where we are. But let's get into, before we get into today, let's get into yesterday a little bit. There's a couple interesting things that happened yesterday, and I know there's one guy that both you and I had yesterday that carried our lineups a little bit. So why don't you give the people a little breakdown of, what happened yesterday and, give them an idea of some of the things that you saw.
Yeah, yesterday was the Jose Iglesias day. He moved to second in that Tigers order, just carried everybody. He was able to carry both of our lineups, and a lot of people had him yesterday. And it was one of those days where, at his price, he was so cheap on both sites that if you didn't have him, chances are you probably weren't going to be cashing in your 50-50s and your head-to-heads. Iglesias was, I believe, 2,400 on FanDuel and just under 3,000, if not just over, on DraftKings. So what he was able to do for you is bring you 25 fantasy points on DraftKings, and I believe he had 9.75 on FanDuel or 5.75 maybe. And what that can do is it can carry the rest of your lineup because at that point you're getting a lot more points than you can imagine. Yesterday was also a day of the pitchers. David Price finally had a decent outing because it's short memory in daily fantasy. Everybody remembers that big negative he put up last week against the Yankees, but he was able to battle yesterday, struck out 6 or 7 batters, had about 20 fantasy points on DraftKings and around, I believe, 14 on FanDuel. But one of the good things we like to talk about is when our process of researching goes through well and rewards us with fantasy points, and that's what happened with James Shields yesterday. He was a right-hand pitcher facing the the Houston Astros, who struggle with strikeouts. They strike out a lot of times this year, and Shields had 12 strikeouts in just 6 innings. Now, even if he gave up a few runs, which he did, I believe only 1 was earned, but even if he was charged with 3 or 4 earned runs, that strikeout total is still more than enough to carry your fantasy team. So yesterday it was all about James Shields and all about Jose Iglesias. Was there anything else that you saw yesterday that was a little bit interesting?
I mean, I pretty much was the same way. Like we were talking about before the show, I had a whole bunch of guys in my lineups who had between 6 and 10 fantasy points. And the thing that really pushed me over the top was the combination of having Shields and Price, and then also having Iglesias in the lineup. There were a couple of the other hot pitchers, the guys that people were talking about, the hot button pitchers, who wound up really blowing up yesterday. Jimmy Nelson is one that comes to mind right off the top of my head. He had been pitching really well, except actually he had 2 really good games and 1 bad game, so now he's got 2 really good games and 2 really bad games because he got absolutely blown up yesterday. Luckily, I had the money to spend up on Price and Shields, so I was able to fit guys in that I wanted to fit in, so I didn't have to come down to Nelson. But that actually brings me up to another point that Rath was talking about this morning in his DFS Minute, how if you played on FanDuel yesterday, you noticed you probably got a few more studs into your lineup than you normally did. They really came down on the prices, and the best way that I said to people that you could see it was if you looked at Willen Rosario. Willen Rosario was the catcher for the Colorado Rockies for most of last season. After about 2 or 3 games this season, Walt Weiss, his manager, absolutely hates him. So he actually demoted him down to AAA. But his price hasn't moved. It's been the same as it was at the beginning of the season. So yesterday, the AAA catcher for the Rockies, Willen Rosario, was actually the 2nd most expensive catcher on FanDuel because they literally cut the prices of everybody else. The only guy whose price didn't really drop was Buster Posey, who was the only guy who's still more expensive than Willen Rosario at the moment. So for whatever that's worth, that's something that's there. So just keep in mind, if you're playing on FanDuel today, a lot of people had been complaining that if you wanted to play a high-priced pitcher, you had to throw in at least one of those $2,200, $2,400 guys in the outfield or somewhere in the middle infield to make your roster work. I guess FanDuel decided that that's not the way they wanted to do it, but I think they kind of over-adjusted a little bit to the other side now, because you could have made some lineups yesterday, throwing in an $8,000 Shields on top with, without anybody who you didn't feel even a little bit uncomfortable about. So, it's good and it's bad. I mean, basically the way I look at it, I don't complain about it like other people do, because everybody's playing with the same salaries and the same salary cap. So the idea is to put together the best team, and whether that means the most studs, if that's easier for you. I mean, it is what it is. That's an argument for another time. But let's get into, if you want to hear more about it, like I said, Rath talked about it this morning in his DFS Minute. So when this show's over, you guys can go click on that, listen to Rath break it down, because he had some good thoughts on the topic. But let's get on and start getting into today. What do you see on the weather front today? Anything that we really need to be aware of?
There's no rain right now at the moment. Of course, the Baltimore game was postponed, but that wasn't weather-related. The only other games that are of note today are because of the wind. There is one game that is blowing straight out, 12 miles an hour, and that's the Angels and the Oakland Athletics. That might be a game to target some big power bats, and I know we're going to detail some Oakland Athletic bats later that may be affected by this wind against a favorable opponent in pitcher Jared Weaver. But in terms of the rest of the games, there isn't much of note. I mean, there's some games that have a mild breeze from left to right, but there's nothing that could affect the potential runs scored or runs allowed in terms of wind. So it's a pretty much clear day in terms of the weather in Major League Baseball, and that's something we like to see, because then there's no alternate factors affecting our lineup construction.
Yep. And I'm going to go on and give you guys a quick overview of the Vegas lines now. It's good to know that obviously we don't got to worry about too much weather. I know last night with the Baltimore game getting canceled, I had to do some scrambling to change some of my lineups around, and that's never a good feeling, because you always wind up making rash, quick decisions when you have to make a swerve like that last minute. So whenever there's weather or potential riot issues to worry about, it's always something you want to you want to have a backup plan for in case things break in the way that's not favorable for you. But today is actually a pretty weird day on the Vegas lines. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games that have run line totals of 7 or less, which kind of goes along with what Josh was saying with today being a day where there's a lot of aces on the mound. There's also 4 games that have totals of 8.5 or more, so there's a lot of feast or famine today. I mean, on a 12-game schedule, we have, like I said, we have 7 games that are 7 or less. We have another 4 games that are 8 runs or more. 8.5 runs or more, so there isn't a lot of middle ground today. They're basically saying these games are going to be shootouts and these other games are going to be pitchers' duels. So let's mention them quick for you so you guys have an idea. Obviously, the pitchers' duel of all pitchers' duels today is going to be that San Francisco and LA Dodger game. You got Clayton Kershaw going up against Madison Bumgarner. The opening line on that game was 5.5, which, again, is one of the lowest ones we've seen all season. It's the second time we've seen a line down to 5.5 on the season. It creeped up a little bit. It's at 6 right now, but again, that's still easily the lowest line on the day. So you got 2 aces on the mound in that one. Not expecting a lot of runs scored. So that's definitely a game where I would shy away from a lot of the bats, especially some of the high-priced ones, because both of those guys can shut down any offense in baseball when they're on their game. And I think it's in LA. LA is not that great of a hitter's park either. So there's a lot of negatives there if you're looking at hitters. And obviously, those 2 guys are expensive, but they are 2 pitchers that you want to have an eye on today. The Houston-San Diego game is at 6.5. Again, we say all the time, whenever San Diego's playing at home, it's one of the best pitchers' parks in baseball. It's one of the parks that yield the least amount of runs. So anytime there's a game in San Diego, you always got to take a peek at the pitchers that are on the mound over there, because there's a good chance that it's going to be a very low-scoring game. And again, after the Dodgers in San Diego at 6, this is the next lowest-scoring one at 6.5. And then we have 5 games that have run totals of 7 runs or less, and that is Washington and Atlanta, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, which was a surprising one for me, Philly, St. Louis, KC, and Cleveland, and then that Angels and Oakland game that Josh just talked about. Now, again, we always say you got to look at the ballparks that these games are being played in. Atlanta is a pitcher's park, so that one makes sense, the Washington-Atlanta game. Philly and St. Louis is in St. Louis. St. Louis is another pitcher's park, so that one makes sense to be a low-run total game. And Oakland and LA, I'm pretty sure is in Oakland, which, again, is another pitcher's park, so it makes a little bit of sense. The other 2 games, though, the Milwaukee-Cincinnati game, that one I was a little bit, taken back by the fact that it had such a low total. And that's a matchup between Johnny Cueto and Kyle Lohse. Now, here's the way I'm looking at this game. They're expecting Cueto against that horrendous Milwaukee Brewers lineup that's beat up and has a whole bunch of injuries. Vegas is expecting Cueto to give up 2 runs or less, which makes him a good play on the day, and we'll get into him in a little bit. But, again, you would normally think a game in Cincinnati and a game between Milwaukee and Cincinnati would have a few more runs scored. So that's one of the ones that stands out as an outlier to me, and I just wanted to make sure I mentioned it to you guys. Moving on to the high run total games, you got Colorado and Arizona at 9. Basically any game that Colorado's in usually has a high total, so that makes some sense. Arizona is a pretty decent hitter's park, so that's why that one's there. You have Seattle and Texas at 9. This is one with 2 bad pitchers in it, so I could see how this one would get up there. And again, Texas is not a bad hitter's ballpark, so that's why it's up in that spot. The third one is Detroit and Minnesota. Minnesota's not really known as a hitter's ballpark, but Mike Pelfrey is also not really known as a major league pitcher. So they're expecting Detroit to really get a bunch of runs against him today. So it's it's an 8.5 run line on that game, and basically people are expecting Sanchez usually gives up a couple runs, and they're expecting Pelfrey to give up a lot of runs today. And then the last game is Toronto and Boston, which is 2 offenses that have a bunch of guys that can mash on them. So that should be the other game that gets a lot of runs up there for you. Now, moving on to the favorites for the pitchers. There's 2 big favorites that stand out today, 2 guys that we're going to talk about when we get to the pitcher section, and that's Johnny Cueto and Michael Wacha. Both of these guys are minus 200 favorites, so huge favorites. Vegas is really expecting them to win, giving them almost a 70% chance to win today. So those are 2 guys that you definitely want to have, want to take a look at when you're building your lineups tonight. Clayton Kershaw is the 3rd biggest favorite at minus 170, and he's going up against Bumgarner, which is the only reason he's not a minus 200 favorite as well, because basically there's good pitching on both sides of that game, and they're expecting it to be a low-scoring game. But still, 170 is a very high money line, so they're expecting a lot out of Kershaw today as well. And then there are three other guys in the mid-range that I just wanted to mention fast. One of them is Anibal Sanchez. He's at a -150. The next one is Sonny Gray. Sonny Gray's -145. And the last one is Tyson Ross at -145 as well. And that has a lot to do with him playing in San Diego and at Good Pitchers Park. So he might be a sneaky guy that's in play as well. But like I said, we're going to get into some of those pitchers that we talked about today. You know, Josh mentioned there's a lot of aces on the board. So, Josh, which way are you going with, you know, which aces are you putting in your hand tonight?
Today is definitely a day to spend up on pitching. As Benny just mentioned, there are a lot of high favorites. There are a lot of low totals. So in the combination of that and other statistics, that's how we use to find our pitchers. And today there's actually 6 guys that I'm looking at. Now, I will that down because, of course, on FanDuel you can only use 1, and in DraftKings you can only use 2. Especially in these 50-50s and head-to-head games, which is something that we're targeting. Obviously, Kershaw is probably the best pitcher in baseball. He had a little bit of a slow start, but he's come back hot lately. I believe he struck out 21 hitters in his last 2 games. He has that large favorite, but the numbers for the Giants, who he's facing today, aren't as favorable as some of the other matchups. The Giants are hitting 248 against lefties, which is not great, but it's a lot better than some of these other pitchers' opponents today, and they strike out only 18.4%. Now, that means stay away from Kershaw because he's still one of the best pitchers in baseball. He has that high favorite in Vegas and that money line. So if you're going to pay up big on pitchers, you'll never have an argument from me, and I'm sure Benny either, on starting Kershaw unless he's playing against a Rockies team in Coors Field with a high over/under or something. But that's something that only happens once or twice a year. So 2 guys that I'm probably going to target most on DraftKings in these 50-50 games are Johnny Cueto and Michael Wacha, with maybe an occasional Tyson Ross sprinkled in. Benny mentioned that Cueto and Wacha have the 2 highest favorites of the day, so that's just one box checked. But listen to this. Johnny Cueto is facing Milwaukee, who, of course, has yielded some of the better games against pitchers all year this season. I detailed last week on RotoHerb on the site in a post that I believe it was 4 of the last 5 top fantasy point games have come against Milwaukee. Of course, Cueto is one of the better pitchers in the game. Now, he did throw over 115 pitches last start, but he's had a full slate of rest, so he should be okay tonight against the Milwaukee Brewers, who are hitting just 231 against righties and have a strikeout rate of 23%, which is a lot. So Cueto is almost a lock for me in my lineups. He's probably the safest option in addition with Kershaw, but Kershaw costs over $2,400 more, and he has a little bit of a tougher matchup as opposed to the Brewers. My next guy is Michael Wacha. I believe Benny has a lot in, so I'll let him detail that for you. But the thing that I'm targeting is that Phillies offense. They're hitting just 209 against righties, and that pretty much sums it up, especially given the fact that Wacha is a favorite. If you're looking to spend a little bit less, Tyson Ross faces the Astros, who strike out a lot. We saw James Shields strike out 12 Houston Astros yesterday. They're only just hitting 230 against righties. So the 3 pitchers that you can target big times today. You're going to go with Kershaw. I would recommend pairing him with either Wacha or Ross, so you're not spending close to $23,000 on DraftKings on your pitchers. But for me, I really like a lot of Cueto and a lot of Wacha. He's building his teams around today as well.
Yeah, Wacha, as Josh alluded to, Wacha's the guy who I'm highest on today. I really like his price, especially over on DraftKings. I think he's very well priced. He's like 82 or 8,400, somewhere in that range. He's a guy who is going up against that Phillies offense, who is basically struggling. Philly has the 3rd lowest batting average in the league so far in 2015, so they're not getting a lot of hits, which limits that negative for them. They're last in the league in runs, which means that they're not scoring a lot of runs, which also limits that negative for them. The one drawback to this game for me is Philly actually doesn't strike out a ton. I think they're only 21st or 22nd right now. I looked at it before yesterday's games were factored in. So they're basically in the bottom 3rd of the league for a number of strikeouts. They're definitely not a team that's going to, it's not like the Astros where you're going to expect Wacha to go out and get 12 or 13 Ks like Shields did yesterday. Philly does. They don't have a lot of guys that are mashing the ball and getting a lot of hits, but they do put the ball in play and they force your defense to make plays. Now, Wacha has actually been pitching a little more to contact lately. His first start this season, he only had 2 strikeouts. Those numbers have kind of gone up. The second start, I think he had 5. Last start, he came out and had 7. But those were against teams that do strike out more than the Phillies do today. So the one drawback to using Wacha today is he might not have a ton of strikeouts, but I do think that he pitches deep into games. He's been going at least 7 innings in most of the games he's played. I think he's a very, very good chance to get the win today. Like we said, the Vegas line is minus 200 on him, so they're giving him, about a 70% chance to be the winner of this game today. And I do think he's going to pick up at least a couple of strikeouts. He does get a couple chances to pitch against the pitcher. There are a couple guys that are, in the bottom of that Phillies order that probably wouldn't be starting on many other teams or even playing significant minutes on many other teams. So there are a couple guys in that lineup that could get some strikeouts for him. And basically, as a team, Philly's only hitting about 210 against right-handed pitching. So Wacha is definitely somebody who's on the top of my list. But I agree with Josh too. I mean, if you're playing in cash games, Wacha and Cueto sounds like a perfect matchup for me to start off my rosters with and then build around those two guys. Basically, when you're playing in these cash games, especially on DraftKings where you can have two pitchers, as I've said before, my goal is to get 120 points if I'm playing in cash games. If I can get 8 to 10 points out of every one of my batters, that's going to give me 70 to 80 points. So if I can figure out a way to get 40 to 50 points out of my pitching, that's going to add it together. That's going to put me in that 115 to 125 range, which is going to cash most of the time in your single entry 50-50s. So if I can get two guys like Cueto and Wacha, I'm going to be pretty confident that those two guys are going to be able to get me about 20 points each, if not more, and put me in that 40 to 50 point range. There are two other guys who I do want to mention. Anibal Sanchez, I think, has a pretty good matchup today. He goes up against a team that's third worst in the league in runs, fifth worst in batting average, and 13th overall in strikeouts in the Minnesota Twins. That Twins offense is not something that scares anybody there. So, I think Sanchez is a guy who can get in there. He's been a high strikeout guy. He's averaging over a strikeout per inning. So if he has high strikeouts and he's playing a team that doesn't get a lot of hits and doesn't score a lot of runs, he limits the negatives, he has a bunch of positives, and he could wind up in a pretty good spot. Another guy I liked who I felt was just very undervalued today is Jake Odorizzi. I know Odorizzi goes up against the Yankees. As you guys have heard before, I'm a big Yankees fan, but this guy's been pitching really well this year. And even though the Yankees bats have kind of been waking up lately, they are still sixth in the league in the most number of strikeouts. So there are a lot of guys in that lineup that are going to K. And, Odorizzi has been striking out a decent amount of guys. I think he had 9 in his last game or the game before that. So he's a guy that could dial it up with some of these strikeouts. Obviously playing, being a right-handed pitcher going up against a lefty-heavy lineup in Yankee Stadium is not ideal. But he's cheaper than a lot of the other guys that we've mentioned. So if you have trouble fitting in some of the bats that you really want, I don't really feel like going down to Odorizzi is a bad way to go today. But, again, when we're talking about pitching, you want the highest safety that you can get. In my cash games today on 2 pitcher sites, I'm going to be going with Wacha and Cueto. And on a 1 pitcher site, depending on how I'm building the rest of my lineups, I'll probably start with Cueto up top. And if I need some extra money, I'll probably wind up going down to Wacha because I do think those are the 2 biggest favorites on the day. But again, like Josh said, there are aces everywhere today. So whoever you like, there are 8 to 10 guys I can make a case for. And I wouldn't argue if anybody started any of those guys today because I think they're all in play. Did you have anybody else that you wanted to mention? I know you were a little bit high on Julio Teheran as well, right?
Yeah, there's like you were just saying, there's a lot of good pitching today, and it's almost the fact that you might have to make a few really cheap, like $1 tournament lineups just to have some exposure to some of these pitchers. It can't hurt to throw in those extra lineups like we talk about. If you're playing the 80-20 approach, which is 80% and 50-50 head-to-heads, 20% in tournament games. With that other 20%, if you can spend $1 or $2 on an extra lineup to have some other guys, it just makes for more fun and more variance to try to get a chance to win. So for today, there's other guys that I do like that I would only use in these tournament plays. Are Julio Teheran against Washington. The Nationals are hitting just .218 against righties, and they're striking out a lot at 22.4% of their at-bats. So Teheran, if he can go deep into a game, has a chance to strike out 8 or 9 batters, which could be the difference in cashing in big tournaments. Now, targeting guys like that and another guy like Anibal Sanchez, it's big today in tournaments because a lot of people will have Cueto, a lot of people will have Kershaw, Wacha, even Madison Bumgarner. So these guys are going to be a little bit lesser owned than they would normally be on most days, but they're still good pitchers, so they can get you a high total while saving you money. And those matchups today, like Teheran against Washington, Sanchez against Minnesota, as Benny mentioned, those are 2 sweet matchups that could give you 20 more points on DraftKings if you put them together, and you'll have more money to spend on bats, which not a lot of people will be able to do today.
Yeah, so that's basically our rundown for some of the pitching today. As we said, there's a lot of ways to go with it, so I can't really argue with a lot of the guys that are going to come out, but you have our thoughts on who the top ones are for your cash games. We're gonna get into our hitters now, and we're gonna spend a little more time on hitters today. We have a couple things that we want to go over while we get into our hitters as well. The first thing I wanted to go over with you guys is a recent article that I posted up on rotocurve.com. We've been getting a lot of questions that, on the show you say that this guy's in a good spot or that guy's in a good spot. Well, what do we actually mean when we say that, hitter A or hitter B is in a good spot? So we put an article up this week on RotoCurve where you guys can find. I'll post it in the chat in a few minutes so you guys can check it out after the show. But I'm going to hit on some of the highlights of that so that you guys have an idea of what we mean when we say that this guy's in a good spot. And then we're going to go through, all the position plays and give you some of the ideas on some of the guys that we like. And while we're doing that, Josh is actually going to get into another teaching point with you guys, basically kind of explaining what it means to be contrarian and how to do it in a smart way. You don't just want to start somebody because nobody else is going to start somebody, and he'll kind of get into it for you on what you really want to look for if you are trying to be contrarian, which again is something that we recommend mostly for tournaments. For cash games, you want to keep it safe. So this is something mostly for some of you guys who are playing in these GPPs on top of the cash games that we always tell you should be your bread and butter. And then, as always, we'll get into how we're going to build our rosters at the end of the show to give you guys an idea of who we're building around and what guys we're using as cornerstones. But I'm going to start it off now with the teaching point on what we mean by guys being in good spots. Guys being in good spots, it comes down to, there were 8 things that we put down on the list on the RotoCurve article about what it means for guys being in good spots. I'm just going to read them off for you real quick. In a perfect world, these are the things that we'd like to see. We'd like to see a batter who has the right splits against that pitcher. Basically meaning if you have a guy who's right-handed and hits left-handed pitching well, and you have a left-handed pitcher on the mound who, basically gives it up to right-handed batters, that's a good splits matchup. The pitcher struggles against batters from that side of the plate. The hitter hits better from pitchers who throw with that hand. Everything fits together, and that makes it a good splits matchup. So a good splits matchup is something that, is basically a cornerstone of what we start looking for when we're doing our research. The next thing is the batter has good lineup placement and protection around them. Now, there are some people who will argue that, it doesn't matter, you don't see better pitches. But if anybody's ever played baseball, you know that if you're in a lineup and you don't have any protection, they're going to pitch around you. Whether you were a stud player in Little League or you're Giancarlo Stanton playing on the Marlins with nobody hitting behind him who scares any pitchers. If a pitcher can pitch around you, sure, he might not intentionally walk you, but he's also not going to intentionally throw you a strike. People know that Giancarlo Stanton, if you throw him a fastball down the middle or up in the zone, he's going to hit the ball a mile. So you know what they do? They keep the ball low. They keep the ball outside. They try to get him to reach at pitches that aren't really in his wheelhouse because they're not worried about putting him on base because he doesn't have somebody behind him. A guy yesterday like Jose Iglesias, if you don't think lineup placement matters, he got fastballs all day long because that's a guy that you're going to challenge as a pitcher, because if you don't get him out and he does get on base, well, now you have a guy on base and now you have to pitch to Miguel Cabrera with the guy on base. So if you're going to challenge somebody and try to pitch around somebody in that lineup, you're going to challenge the guys like Iglesias or Kinsler up top and try to pitch around a guy like Cabrera if you can. And again, like I said, there are people who believe in it. There are people who believe that this is all voodoo, but lineup placement helps. If you're in a good spot in the lineup, you also have a chance for more RBIs, more runs scored. If you have guys behind you that can drive in a lot of runs, you're going to get driven in more often. So lineup placement is something that's important. If it wasn't important, then we wouldn't be telling you guys all the time, look for the guys in the top 5 that you can put into your lineup, or the fact that Iglesias was a great play yesterday because he was moving up into the 2-hole. Another thing that we like to look at is batters whose ballpark factors are good strengths for them. If you're a left-handed power hitter going up against a right-handed pitcher in Yankee Stadium with the short porch down the line in right field, that's something that's going to be a bump up for you. It's not a sole reason I would play, one guy, but it might be a reason why if I have 2 guys who are close, I'll pick player A over player B if the ballpark factor is in his favor. If you have a guy who's in a pitcher's park like San Diego versus a guy who's in a hitter's park like Coors Field, it's pretty obvious which guy is in a little bit of a better position. So sometimes even if a guy's matchup is a little worse, the ballpark factor would bump him up in my eyes and, make him a better play. The total runs expected for the game is another thing we look at. If you have a whole roster full of guys who are playing in, games with only 5 or 6 runs expected or 6.5 runs expected, just by sheer math, there's going to be less scoring, less runs, less run scoring opportunity in that game than there would be if you have a whole bunch of guys in your Coors Field roster where the total on that game is 9 or 10 runs. So it's not the sole thing again that you want to look at, but when you're deciding between two players, if one of them is going to be in a high-scoring game and another one is expected to be in a pitcher's duel, you want to take the guy with the high-scoring game for fantasy purposes if you're talking about your hitters. Another thing I like to look at is who is the pitcher on the other side? Is the pitcher an elite guy? I don't care how good a matchup is. If you have Troy Tulowitzki, who smashes left-handed pitching, going up against Clayton Kershaw, every once in a while, like it was earlier in the year, you might get lucky and get a good, a good play out of it and him hit a home run. But 9 times out of 10, if you're taking guys against an elite pitcher, that elite pitcher is going to do what that elite pitcher usually does, and he's going to shut down the opposing offense. So you don't want to be spending up on guys who are going up against, the Kershaws, the Scherzers, the Prices of the world. Because, again, every once in a while, those guys will get blown up, and it'll work out. But we want to worry about the process. And over the long haul, if you keep rostering guys against those stud pitchers, it's not going to work out very well for you in the end. And then now just another thing as well we're going to add in is we always talk, or at least, I always talk when D. Gordon is in a good spot about why I like using D. Gordon, because he has elite speed on the base pads, and the more that he gets on base and the better his matchup is with the catcher, the more of a chance he has to steal some bases and get on with it. So that's another thing that you want to look at with your hitters. It doesn't happen all the time, and there's very few of those elite speed guys that you want to do this with. But anytime you think that one of your elite speed guys has a chance to get on base more than once, there's a good chance that he's going to try to steal a base at least once, if not more than once. And again, we talked about how on DraftKings, speed is a big asset to have. So if you can get one of those guys and you can get his speed, that's another thing you want to look for your hitters. So when we say good spots, these are some of the ideas that we talk about and some of the ways that it plays out for you. If you want, I'm going to post that article link into the chat. You guys can take a look at that later on today. And this way, when you hear Josh and I, say things like we feel like this guy's in a good spot for this reason or that reason, you have a little bit more of an idea of what we're talking about. And also for yourselves, so you can figure out which guys are in good spots for yourselves and make sure you get them into your lineups. So speaking of guys that are in good spots today, I know Josh has a catcher that he really likes that we think is in a great spot today. So you want to tell the people who you're using that catcher?
Yeah, Stephen Vogt is in a great spot today. And speaking of that link, I actually just posted that on the chat. So for those of you watching the show with the link up, it's actually in the chat room right now. Be sure to bookmark that or just open it in another tab. It's a good thing to read. As Benny was just saying, it's a good way to do your own research and learn what we're talking about. That's what we're all about teaching you guys how to do your own research rather than just spitting out names for people to use, wondering how we found those out. One of those guys that we are targeting, like we just talked about, is Vogt today. I'm all over him, as Benny is as well, and he will discuss it in the detail in a bit. But one other catcher that I do like is Alex Avila for the Detroit Tigers. Now, this guy isn't an advised play in 50-50s and head-to-head games today. The reason why, as Benny just talked about, he's not in a great spot because he's down in that Tigers lineup. But he does have a good split matchup. He faces a right-handed Pelfrey who, as Benny said earlier, we're still wondering why he's a major league pitcher. Now, he has been good so far this year, but it looks like he's going to regress to the mean, and that's something we'll be seeing in the coming starts, especially with his some of his other numbers indicating that he's been getting lucky so far. So, Benny, can you talk more about Vogt and why we're targeting him today?
Yeah, well, basically, Stephen Vogt is a guy who I love. Last year, Oakland had 3 catchers, and they all got a little bit of time, and they all played when they were in the right kind of matchup. And basically, like we just said, it would be when they were in the right splits matchup. And the splits matchup where Vogt got the most of his playing time was when they went up against right-handed pitching. So far this year, Vogt's hitting .345 is his batting average, and he has an on-base plus slugging percentage over 1,000. Now, for those of you who don't follow that stat, when you have an on-base plus slugging over 1,000, I mean, that's just silly. Like, that puts you in the level of one of the elite hitters in the entire league. He's hitting third in that order for Oakland. Most likely he'll be hitting third again in that order for Oakland today when lineups come out. He's got the right splits matchup, being a lefty going up against a righty who gives it up a little bit. Jared Weaver's not somebody who's been blowing people away anymore. His fastball is basically topping out in the high 80s at this point. So he's basically a soft-tossing right-handed pitcher. And a soft-tossing right-handed pitcher is somebody that Stephen Vogt is going to be feasting on or has feasted on in the past. So he has a very good profile to have a good game today. He's, like I said, he's going to be batting third in that order. He's going up against Weaver. I expect Oakland to put up some runs, and so does Vegas today. So that's definitely a decent game and a decent spot for you to target him. His price has come up a little bit, but then again, there's only so many guys at the catcher position that hit in a prime spot in the lineup. There's very few catchers that hit anywhere between the 1 and 5 spot in lineups. So when you have a guy who's hitting in the 3-hole, a prime RBI spot, right in the middle of that order, it's something that you definitely got to take advantage of. There's also one other catcher that I wanted to mention who pretty much falls into the same boat today, and that's A.J. Pierzynski. Pierzynski is now batting cleanup for Atlanta, which says a lot about the Atlanta lineup, but also says a lot about how hot he's been. He's hitting .385 right now through the season. He's got a 9-game hitting streak going. He's a lefty who gets a right-hander today as well, so he's also in a good splits matchup. And the thing I like about Pierzynski a little bit more than Vogt is that he's pretty cheap. So you're probably going to see both of these guys pretty highly owned today. But for cash game, you could literally go either way, and you would get no arguments from me. You got good lineup placement. You got a good splits matchup. Both of these guys have a lot of things going in their favor. And basically, it just comes down to when you're constructing your roster. If you got enough money to pay up for Vogt, then you pay up for Vogt. If you need to, come off of Vogt to get a couple more bucks to get somebody better upgraded at a different position, you can come down to a guy like Pierzynski for your cash games. But basically, if you're playing in these tournaments, you might want to go a little bit contrarian because these guys are going to be very highly owned. So, Josh, do you want to give the people a little bit of an idea of what we mean by going contrarian and what we look like for what we look for when we are going to go contrarian?
Yeah, it brings up a great point because a lot of people will talk about when playing in these tournaments. Obviously, when we're focusing on these 50-50 and head-to-heads, as we detailed in the last show on Friday, be sure to enter those in at least one cheap tournament because you never know when you're going to have a great day. Now, some people will say, well, if these guys are highly owned, you need to find guys that are lesser owned. But how do we find those guys? A lot of people will talk about just, I'm going to play this guy just because, or this guy hasn't hit in a while, so maybe you'll hit today. Well, that's part of the reason why I'm him in the butt, because when you talk about some of these guys going contrarian just because, that's not the way to do it. That there's a way to be contrarian, to go against the grain is what that means, but still be smart about it. And that's kind of what Alex Avila is today. We talked about Steve Vogt and A.J. Pierzynski. They're both very good safe plays, and they'll have a decent price with a great matchup. Now, all those people will be on then. Now, what do you mean by going against the grain or contrarian? That would be Alex Avila today, because he's not in that top 5 of the order. He's not a guy that's because there isn't great talent behind or in front of him as he's down in the order. But there's a right way to do that. There's a right way to find that. And what we mean by going against the grain is, like we just said, by finding players that aren't higher owned. But you have to find why. In Avila's case, it's because he's not hitting in the top 5 of the order. Now, that doesn't mean he has a bad matchup as he's going against Mike Pelfrey. So that's just one reason why you would put him in. A lot of the things that people will find in terms of going against the grain is ill-advised. Like today, starting a left-handed hitter against Clayton Kershaw. People will say, oh, well, yeah, if he's a hit or home run, then nobody will have him and it'll be a great day. Well, yes, but there's a very low likelihood of that happening, especially with Kershaw being one of the best, probably the best left-handed pitcher in the game. He absolutely dominates lefties. He's a great slider, good fastball in the upper 90s when he can pump it. And one of the reasons behind that is you're not going to be able to get a hit off. And that's why we talk about throwing darts and starting a left-handed hitter against Kershaw just because it's not advised. So there's ways to go against the grain. There's ways to be contrarian, and that's if you find a research or if you find something that can still put him in a good matchup regardless, like Avila today against Pelfrey, regardless of his batting spot. That is a way to go against the grain, and it's a way to find a good matchup. It's not about finding these guys who could just possibly go off just because you're throwing darts. That's not how we do it. A lot of people have written a lot of good things about finding ways to go against the grain. And if you look about it and think about it, it's all about finding that matchup, and that's what you can do. And that's what Avila is today, along with some other guys. Benny, do you have anything to add of contrarian? Because there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but you can't just do it for the sake of it.
Yeah, the one thing I want to add to people is price is not a reason to be contrarian. I get a lot of emails or a lot of tweets from people that basically say, well, what do you think about this guy? He's minimum price. Well, there's a difference between being minimum price and being in a good spot, or or being a good start. Last week a guy like Jimmy Paredes was minimum price, but he was a good start because he was moving up in the order. He was in a good spot in the order. He's been hot. He's been hitting. He had the right splits matchup. There were a lot of other things that were going in his favor as well. So yes, he was minimum price, and he was a guy you wanted to play at minimum price. But the fact that he was minimum price was not the only reason that you were playing him. There were other things that were going in his favor. Sometimes somebody will say to me, oh, hey, I saw that this catcher is starting that just got called up today. He's batting 6th in the order, against a good pitcher, but he's minimum price. Well, if the only thing he has going for him is that he's minimum priced, that's not the guy that you want to use. That's not being contrarian. That's not being smart, being contrarian. That's just throwing a guy in there and throwing darts and hoping you get lucky. If you're going to start a guy, you need to be able to give a reason why you're going to start a guy. Think about it like you're writing a paper when you were back in college. You don't just throw a point out there for no reason. You have to throw that point out there and back it up. So if you want to put a certain guy in your lineup, you have to say, I'm starting this guy in my lineup today because, and you need to be able to put a because after it. If the only because you can put after it is because his price is $2,000 or because his price is minimum price, that's not a good enough reason for you to throw that guy in your lineup. Yeah, you may get lucky. That guy may get into one and hit a home run. But, again, we talk about the process over the long term, over the long haul, over the entire season. Just throwing those min price guys in there because they're min price is not going to be something that winds up returning you, good value. So that's the one thing that I'll add. I agree with everything that Josh said. If you're playing in some of these tournaments, sometimes you got to look to be a little bit contrarian. But being contrarian doesn't mean, taking a guy who has nothing going for him on the day. On a day like the other day where Chris Sale was pitching on the mound, being contrarian could just be picking the third best pitcher on that day instead of going and picking Sale, who everyone's going to have at 50 or 60%. Like yesterday, Shields was 60 or 70%. If you wanted to be contrarian and go off of Shields and take somebody like Lackey, that was a great contrarian play yesterday. That made a lot of sense. Lackey had a lot of things going for him. He had a lot of upside that, he could get there. And, hey, if Shields didn't happen to get blown up, you would have been in a really good spot. So that would have been something to be contrarian. If you decided to take a pitcher who was, a gas can that most people were expecting to get blown up yesterday, hoping he has the start of his life, that's not being smart, being contrarian. So that's the way we want you guys to think about it. It has to be more than just price, the reason why you're doing it. You have to have a reason why you're starting that guy. You have to have a reason why you're thinking that guy could have a good start today. Otherwise, you're just basically burning money. So with that being said, let's move on and talk a little bit about first baseman. The guy who I like the most today, who I know Josh is on as well, is Joey Votto. Votto was going up against Kyle Lohse. Kyle Lohse is a guy who struggles with left-handed bats. That game is being played in a good hitter's park in Cincinnati. Votto has good lineup placement, second in his lineup, and he's a guy who does very well against right-handed pitching. Another reason why I like him today is he's got a high likelihood for a home run. Now, I'm not going to go out there and call a home run for Votto today, but Lohse is a guy who does give up a lot of fly balls. So when you have a guy who gives up a lot of fly balls and a left-handed pitcher who's, a right-handed pitcher who gives up a lot of fly balls and a left-handed batter who can put the ball in the air often, Votto's got a lot of power. When he puts the ball in the air, there's a good chance that he can get a home run out of it, drive the ball, basically out of the ballpark. And as we've seen before, he's the kind of guy who has multiple home run upside when he's in a good matchup. So at first base today, if I have the money to spend up, Joey Votto is the guy who I'm going to be going for. I know Josh likes him as well, but don't you have somebody else that you might be on today at first?
Yeah, you make a great point about Votto. I'm definitely going to be on him in my lineups today. I have the money to spend. But another guy, and I'm not sure about his price on FanDuel, but I know his price came up on DraftKings, is Lucas Duda. The guy's been one of the better hitters in the league so far, and for a guy that's such a bat, he rarely strikes out. I mean, when you watch the Mets play, he's making contact with almost every pitch, making contact with curveballs from lefties, changeups from righties, and he's making a lot of contact with the ball no matter what, which is a good thing to see because if you get a chance to put a ball in play, you can get fantasy points, you can get hits. And that's another reason why I bought him. This guy rarely strikes out, and I think he has a total of 23 infield pop-ups in his career. His whole career. That's incredible. And when you talk about a guy like Lohse that does pitch to contact and he doesn't strike guys out a lot, that's a good way to put Votto in your lineup because he'll get 4 at-bats. He's going to have a chance to hit a home run, to hit a double, stuff like that. So I like Votto as well, but if you don't want to put in Votto, cheaper on FanDuel, I do like Lucas Duda because he's been one of the hotter hitters in the game, and he crushes pitchers that don't have great stuff, and that's exactly what Dave Phelps is. He's just a guy that can come in, throw fastball on the zone. He has a decent curveball, but Duda's shown the ability to hit those pitches. So of Votto and Duda, I would prefer to play Votto, especially in 50-50s and head-to-heads. But if you want to look for a separate option, maybe in these tournaments, Duda's definitely a guy to look at. I know there's a second baseman that we're both on as well, plays for the Pirates. You want to detail him, Betty?
Yeah, kind of lost in the shuffle last week, especially on FanDuel, has been Neil Walker. Last week was Jimmy Paredes' week, and, he's second base eligible on FanDuel. Everybody was throwing him in their FanDuel lineups. But Neil Walker's been as hot as anybody in baseball right now. He's got a 10-game hitting streak going. On DraftKings, he's averaged 11 points per game over his last 5 games. He's batting cleanup in that Pirates order. And today he gets to go up against Travis Wood, who's a pretty weak left-handed pitcher for the Chicago Cubs, and I'm pretty sure that game's at Wrigley Field, so he's getting a ballpark boost as well. He has some guys hitting in front of him that are high on-base percentage guys and who also profile to do well against a pitcher like Travis Wood. You got Josh Harrison leading off up there, who's a guy that was great last year against left-handed pitching. You got Andrew McCutchen, who doesn't really look right at the plate yet, but this is a guy who has MVP kind of upside, so sooner or later he's going to turn it on again as well. And again, it goes back to what we talked about before. How many second basemen do you find that are in a good lineup spot where they have a chance to drive in some runs and also be driven in? And how many of them are, basically hitting the way that Neil Walker has been hitting so far to start the season? I know there are a lot of people who will argue the merits of hot streaks with you, and I'm not one of them. What I like to say is if a guy's looking good and he's hitting the ball well and he's seeing the ball well, not that it's a lock that that's going to continue, but I would rather have a guy who I know is hitting the ball well and seeing the ball well than a guy who hasn't been hitting lately. And again, if I could get a guy like Walker who's pretty reasonably priced, I think he's only $4,200 on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I know he's in the threes somewhere, but not overly expensive where it would push me off of him. He's a guy that I definitely think is worthy of including in your lineup today. There are some other second basemen who I also think are good. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of Dee Gordon. He's another guy today. He gets a weak right-handed pitcher to go up against, so there's a good chance that he could get on base multiple times, especially on DraftKings. It's more of a DraftKings play with Dee Gordon for me. The more times he's expected to get on base, the more opportunities he's going to have to steal a base. If he gets on base twice and steals a base and scores a run, he's going to wind up with double-digit points for you. If you can get double-digit points out of every guy on your roster in a cash game out of all the hitters, you're going to get to that mythical 120-point barrier that I talked about, where you're going to cash in all your 50-50s and be right on the borderline in GPPs, the big tournaments, depending on how other things go on the day. So as much as I like Dee Gordon, I think Neil Walker is probably a little bit of a better bet today. And there's actually another guy who both Josh and I are on that I'll let him talk about. You want to tell the people why you like Ian Kinsler so much?
Yeah, we like Kinsler a lot because he checks all the boxes today. One of the guys that is a big target in these 50-50s and head-to-heads. But he's very pricey, especially at second base, considering that we're going to be trying to roster some of the more expensive pitchers. So you might want to go away from spending up at second base with Kinsler and maybe move down to a Walker or a Dee Gordon, who are a little bit cheaper, depending on which site you play on. But if you have the money, Kinsler's the guy for me at second base. He's expected to hit leadoff again with Rajai Davis out and Anthony Goes being moved down in the order to about 9th when he does start. But if he's hitting leadoff in front of guys like Miguel Cabrera, as J.D. Martinez, who has been one of the better outfielding hitters in the baseball in the last 2 years, he has a ton of chances to score runs. He's going to get 4 or 5 at-bats, especially against Pelfrey, who has struggled and in terms of allowing hits and stuff, but just hasn't given up many runs yet, and that could come today against a powerful Tigers. Now, with Kinsler leading to that, I'm taking chances on him to score a few runs, and he has a chance to get some hits and some walks too, because the guy has a high on-base percentage, and all those things translate to fantasy points, which is exactly what we're looking for, especially at second base, which is a little bit of a weaker position. I know there's some guys at third base today that are expensive but worth paying for, and that first guy for me is Chris Bryant. Faces a left-hander in F-Lock today. He hit these very hard in the minor leagues. Of course, he hit everybody hard in the minor leagues, leading all levels of baseball on home runs. But What Bryant's been able to do since his first game, where he struck out 3 times, I believe, in 4 at-bats, is incredible. His batting average is over 350. He's hitting the ball in the gap. He's scoring runs. He's driving runs. He even had stolen base. So Bryant had the eye to hit a home run and score runs, especially hitting fourth in the lineup. In this against a left-handed pitcher, I do like him a lot. Is there another expensive third baseman it's worth paying up for today, Benny?
Well, I mean, you talked about Kinsler already, and they're going up against Mike Pelfrey today, who's a guy that we're going to be targeting all day long. So the guy who I have right now at third base is Miguel Cabrera. Now, if you don't know, Miguel Cabrera has Triple Crown winning kind of upside. High average, home runs, runs batted in. So I really don't got to give you the case on why I like that guy. But here's why I like the matchup for him today. Mike Pelfrey is a guy who has had some reverse splits over the last couple years. And again, to get back into what that means is he's a right-handed pitcher who right-handed batters actually hit better against than left-handed batters do. It has something to do with the pitch selection and the way that he throws his pitches. A lot of times it has to do with the off-speed pitches. Guys who do or don't have good off-speed pitches tend to do better against guys of the opposite hand. He does not have a very good off-speed pitch, so he doesn't have something that can keep the right-handed batters off balance. And again, Miguel Cabrera has the kind of upside where any game he steps out there, he can go 4 for 4 with 2 home runs. One of the best hitters that we've seen in our lifetime, one of the best hitters of this generation, and I'm expecting that Detroit team to score a ton of runs today. So if he's got guys like Kinsler and the next guy who we're going to get into and talk to in Jose Iglesias hitting in front of him, he's going to have guys on base when he gets up today. So at third base, like I said, I agree with Josh. It's a day to pay up. Brian is in a good spot. Miggy's in a good spot. Chris Davis from the Orioles was another guy who I liked and was going to mention, but with that game being canceled, it just makes our choices a little easier. A couple less guys for us to consider. But getting back into it now, going on to shortstop and staying with these Detroit Tigers, Josh and I both think that this guy is almost a must-play today, especially if he's still hitting in the 2-hole. So do you want to give people a little bit of an idea of why we love Jose Iglesias so much?
Yeah, Iglesias was a guy yesterday that was huge for everybody, especially moving up in that order. And he's going to hit second again today, and there's no reason why he's not wouldn't, because the guy's just been tearing the cover off the ball. As we just said, with Kinsler being able to score runs at the top of the order in front of some of those talented hitters in Detroit, Iglesias is right next to Kinsler, and he's actually closer to those guys in terms of scoring runs. The only difference, Iglesias is about $1,000 cheaper, which makes him one of the guys that we're targeting heavily today because we need that salary relief, paying up for these big pitchers and being able to fit a guy like Nelson Cruz, which we'll get into in a minute. So we want to be able to fit those big bats and those big pitchers. Iglesias is a guy to be able to do that. He has the upside to score over 20 fantasy points, which he did yesterday, because he has a lot of power considering his frame. He hit a triple yesterday. He can score runs, can drive in runs, and he actually can steal bases. Now, the fact is that he's going to be hitting in front of Miguel Cabrera. So chances are, if he gets on first, they're not going to be sending guys in motion to take the bat out of Miguel Cabrera's hands. But that doesn't matter because he has the upside to score a lot of runs. He's going to get more 5 at bats. And for his price, there's no better play at shortstop for me, and I'm sure for Bennington as well.
Yeah, and again, the other reason why I love Iglesias as well, as Josh kind of alluded to a little bit there at the end, is Iglesias is one of those guys who gives you the salary you need, while still allowing you to keep the same type of upside that you've had all along. He's the guy with his new spot in the order. His price hasn't come up to match that spot in the order yet, so he has the upside of being somebody who's hitting second around all those big bats that he has around him, but his price is still priced like a guy who's hitting 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th in the order, and that's really why we want to make sure we take advantage of him again today here. So he's a guy who has a high batting average. He always has. He doesn't have a ton of power, but he gets on base a lot. He gets a lot of hits. And, again, with his new spot in the order, there's a good chance a lot of those guys behind him are going to be driving him in for some runs today. So, he's basically the guy who I have in every one of my cash games. He's going to be very highly owned if you're playing in tournaments, so you may want to go away from him if you're trying to be contrarian. But, again, I mean, if a guy's that cheap and is in such a good position, is in such a good spot, there's really no reason not to play him. So let's move on right now to outfield. I know from everything that I have been reading this morning, there were a lot of people who were on a lot of these Baltimore outfielders. So there's going to be a little bit of scrambling going on today. Who are some of the other outfielders that we could use now that we lose guys like Adam Jones and Delman Young and Paredes and all those guys?
And it brings up a good point because guys yesterday were saying they saw a lot of Orioles hitters in lineups, and that's just a good thing for those of us that are able to keep up with the news and keep those guys out of our lineup. So in these 50-50s and head-to-heads today, if you see some Orioles, chances are you're going to be able to cash. Now, some guys that we like that aren't Orioles will be given a boost because we don't have to target that guy, especially against Hector Noesi. One guy today that I know Benny likes as well. He's very expensive, but Nelson Cruz is one of the top plays on the day today. If there was anyone that we had to say has the highest chance of hitting a home run, for me it would be Nelson Cruz. He's facing a left-handed pitcher, I believe, Ross Detweiler, who has not been good, to say the least. And the thing is about Nelson Cruz, who is the leading home run hitter, the guy just absolutely mashes left-handed pitching. That's why Seattle paid up for him and brought him to that Matt Park and Safeco up there. But Cruz has the ability to hit a home run, and if not one, two, if Detweiler stays in the game. Now, that is a lot to ask for, but that's what you're paying for today. So be sure to target Cruz in these tournaments. But he's very expensive. You might not be able to get him in your 50-50s and head-to-heads, and that's why I'm not spending as much on outfield and targeting guys like Nick Markakis. And the reason I like Markakis is he hit in the top 3 in that order. He probably will lead off today. And it's A.J. Cole, who A.J. Cole is starting today from Max Scherzer. For those that didn't catch the news, Scherzer is scratched today because of injury. He hurt himself taking a swing in the last game, actually. That's what happened to those guys that come over from the AL. They got to get used to hitting the ball. Pitcher. But the reason we like Markakis is against Cole, who hasn't pitched much in major leagues, if at all. And Markakis is one of the better professional hitters. It's a term that sounds a bit like just like a dirt ball or something like that. But Nick Markakis can do multiple things to get on base. He has a great on-base percentage his whole career. He has the ability to hit the ball into the gap, to hit a home run. And being in front of guys like Freddie Freeman and A.J. Pierzynski, who we detailed earlier, gives him a chance to score a run or two. And that's exactly why I like to target him, because he is a cheap bat in the outfield, and why we need those guys, because we're going to be paying out for pitching today. So if you can fit Cruz, I'd be more than happy putting him into my lineup today. But if you can't, target guys like Nick Markakis. Is there any other cheap outfielders that you like today, Benny?
Well, Markakis was the one cheap guy that I'm really on as well. You could also look at some of those. If you're looking for cheap guys, you could also look at some of the guys in Arizona. You never know who's going to be playing for them. I'm assuming that today might be David Peralta day or an A.J. Pollock day. I think those guys are in a good spot against Kyle Kendrick. But the one other guy that I wanted to mention that I would pay up for today is actually Andrew McCutchen. He hasn't been great so far to start this year, but this guy has a lot of upside. And the one thing he does really, really well is hit left-handed pitching. And with him going up against Travis Wood, who's a left-handed pitcher who I think is kind of a gas can, I'm expecting that Pirates offense to put up a couple runs today. He hits in front of Neil Walker, so he has a little bit of protection in that lineup. He does have guys in front of him like Josh Harrison. He had Gregory Polanco in front of him, who's been hot. Polanco was scratched last minute yesterday for some reason. I never actually got that reason, so just keep an eye on that as well and see what that was all about, because you may have a little bit of shuffling going on in that Pittsburgh lineup. But McCutchen's another guy who I really like and I'm really on. All the bats for Detroit against Pelfrey are in play, so any of the Detroit outfielders that you want to fit in there, those guys are also guys that you can take a look at as well. And that basically brings us to the end of our analysis of the position players. Josh, do you want to tell the people a little bit about how you're going to be going about building your rosters for tonight?
I'm spending on pitching today. Today's one of those days to do that, and I think you'll be struggling to cash in your 50-50s and head-to-heads if you don't pay for pitching tonight. On DraftKings, I'm probably going to be spending $20,000 of my cap or more on pitching. Michael Wacha, Johnny Cueto, Tyson Ross, Clayton Kershaw are all 4 guys that I'll be looking at. But in terms of my games, I'll be targeting Johnny Cueto and Michael Wacha because they allow a little bit more room to spend on hitters as opposed to guys like Kershaw who cost about $2,500 more on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I think you might have to get Kershaw, and if you don't want to go for him, if he's too expensive, Cueto's that second play because he has that great matchup. But be able to target guys like that, you're going to need relief in your lineups, and that's exactly why Jose Iglesias and Nick Markakis are going to be in all my 50-50 and head-to-head lineups because they offer that cap relief to be able to spend on a bat that I think I have today, and that's Nelson Cruz. Benny, what are you doing for your lineups today?
I'm going to be honest, man. We're pretty much in agreement on almost everything today. In my cash games on a 2-pitcher site, I'm going to have a lot of Cueto, a lot of Wacha. Those are 2 guys who I think are in really good spots, especially on DraftKings. I think their price is really good. If you're playing over on Fantasy Aces, I think it's a lot easier to get a guy like Kershaw in over there. I don't think his price is as restrictive based on, what his price is versus the other options that you have. So if you're playing over on Aces, I definitely think you're going to see a lot of Kershaw tonight. On FanDuel, I'd agree with you as well. If you can afford to pay up for Kershaw, you pay up for Kershaw. If not, Johnny Cueto is very close in price and is a very good swerve off of him. I agree 100% with Iglesias. If you're going to pay up for pitching today, you're going to need to save somewhere. He's the best of all the cheaper, the cheaper priced bats that I see today. And I also agree completely with Nelson Cruz. If you're gonna save up so that you can get one big bat into your lineup, Nelson Cruz's boomstick is the one big bat I want in my lineup today. So I'm going to be doing basically the same thing that Josh just said from that point of view. In my cash games, you're going to see a lot of Cueto and Waka probably. You're definitely going to see Iglesias. You're going to see Nelson Cruz. I really like Stephen Vogt today. He's a little bit pricey, but if I can fit him in, he's going to go in. The places I can't fit him, I'm going to use Brzezinski. There's always a million options at first base that you can go with, and there's always a lot of options at third base that you can wind up going with. But those are two positions where I'm going to look for some power, try to get some power into my lineup. Unfortunately, at second base, all the guys I like are over 4,000 on DraftKings, over 3,000 on FanDuel. So I'm going to have some money to spend up over there. And, that's basically it. I'm going to see if I can find a cheap outfielder or two when lineups come out, or maybe a cheap second or third baseman that I can put in there as well so I can fit the rest of the studs that I want. And that's how I'm going to go with it. See how it works out. Hopefully it turns into a profitable night again.
For sure, and that brings us right to the top of the hour. We will be back tomorrow, Wednesday, April 29th at noon, as always, on RotoCurve for the Curve. Be sure to check out the website at rotocurve.com. Follow myself on Twitter, Josh Kalachi, and Benny at BennyR11. You can also find the RotoCurve handle at RotoCurve as well. We answer any questions you have all day. We'll also be in the chat and in the forums. Be sure to check out all the RotoCurve tools as well. There's a ton of different things you can do to help with your lineups, in addition to the show that we just talked about. Also, one other mention to the article that Benny alluded to earlier. Be sure to read that. It'll help you in your research. I know I'm going to give it a